He was a giant in Bohemian music who attempted to influence the burgeoning artistic culture of the New World by spending time in Iowa. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Antonín Dvořák. Antonín Dvořák was born in the modern-day Czech Republic, north of Prague, in September of 1841. His parents would go on to have 13 other children, about half of whom would survive infancy. His father, a zither player, was well attuned to the folk idioms of their native Bohemia, and Antonín was a promising student on the violin. In order to advance his education, he needed to learn German, which he did by spending some time with his German-speaking uncle who lived not far to the west. His German knowledge served him well, as he was able to undertake further musical study with an apparently short-mannered and ill-tempered fellow named Anton Lehmann, who was an organist in town and taught Antonín to play that instrument as well as the piano. Though his father, a butcher by trade, was a semi-professional zither player, he was skeptical about the idea of his son going into music. But the organ was unique in that there were enough churches around to provide steady employment. Also, Dvořák would later recount that as a kid, he was once dragged into a lake by some cattle he was escorting home from the fair, and at that point he told himself that the family business really wasn't for him. So off went the young Dvořák to Prague itself, where he studied at a place called the Organ School. Technically, it was the Institute for Church Music, but everyone called it the Organ School. They boasted high-quality teachers, but low-quality facilities. He filled in as a violist in local orchestras when necessary, but mostly he just doubled down on his studies, and he graduated near the top of his class. Yet despite all of this, he was rejected from the first organist job he applied for, because even though he was qualified for it, he was directly out of school, and they wouldn't hire him. Thus began a period of great poverty. The only musical work he could find were in giving piano lessons and continuing to play the viola in various orchestras. This was an era when most violists were musical journeymen like Dvořák. They had no aspirations to be professional violists because there really was no room for the professional violist like there is today. It was just considered a fill-in instrument, and a lot of the violists who were in these orchestras were not necessarily even primarily string players. They were just people trying to make a living and trying to make a few extra bucks. His first few compositions came at this time, with an A minor string quintet appearing as his Opus 1. He had written earlier pieces, but this was the first piece he really felt comfortable actually wanting to put out there as one of his works. The rest of them were destroyed or lost or just stuffed in a bottom drawer somewhere. His compositions throughout the next decade, which included a C minor symphony, did not see a shred of performance for at least 10 years, with some having to wait over a century for their world premieres, which seems baffling considering the heights to which Dvořák would reach. But in the 1860s, he was a hopeless case. Going for broke in large-scale compositions where the influence of Richard Wagner was just too palpable to help Dvořák develop his own style. This was hard because often he had very little money, and it was hard for him to even buy paper. It just goes to show how important composition was to him. 1871 proved a big year in that he left his orchestra job, which was for peanuts, but it was better than nothing. What's stranger is that he up and left this field for work in composition, and he hadn't had a single actual success in that realm yet. Talk about jumping off a cliff. A smattering of performances did follow, such as the overture to his second opera. Yes, he had written 2 operas at this point, but it still was not enough to actually get him on the map. In 1873, he married his wife Anna, who was the younger sister of one of his piano students with whom he had previously fallen in love, proving that marrying your first love's younger sister is a time-honored composer tradition. Haydn, Mozart, now Dvořák, seems to be a theme here. He was able to get a job as an organist through his old professor at the organ school, and his new wife was able to sing in some local churches to make some extra money. Also, I should probably mention it was a bit of a shotgun wedding situation because she was 4 months pregnant at the time. At this point, his prospects began to look up, as the first concert performance of a chamber work of his came when his A major piano quintet, Opus 5, was performed. This was followed closely thereafter by a patriotically themed cantata that roused the national fervor at a time of increased musical nationalism. People loved it, and he was fast becoming known as a rising star, albeit just in Prague. Outside the city, people really didn't know who he was. All of this was about to change when he went for something called the Austrian State Prize, which was basically a stipend for composers. In order to make his absolute best showing, Dvořák sent in a veritable mountain of music, and this left one of the members of the jury, Johannes Brahms, what we might call in our modern-day terminology, shook. He saw all of this music, which included 2 symphonies, and that wasn't even the half of it, and he saw that it wasn't just a lot of music, but it was also good. He won the prize, and this gave him enough money to actually get a piano. He hadn't had access to a piano on a regular basis since he'd borrowed an old beat-up spinet from an old roommate several years prior. Over the next few years, he went for the award again and again. He failed to win in 1875, but he won again in each of the next 2 years. And after he had won 3 out of the last 4, the music critic Eduard Hanslick wrote him, describing who was on the jury and saying that they would be more than happy to help him in any way that they could, because they liked his music. Also, they probably thought that if they helped him get on his feet financially, they wouldn't have to keep giving him the stipend every year. Dvořák was understandably overjoyed at this big break, and Brahms recommended to his publisher Dvořák's Moravian Duets, who then turned around and commissioned the now famous Slavonic dances. These sold like hotcakes, especially when the orchestral version was first performed. You see, back then, pieces for orchestra that were concert crowd pleasers would often be published in piano or piano for hands forms, so that in the absence of record players, people could go home and relive the moments of the big pieces that they really liked. And this also helped to drive sheet music sales. When allied with Dvořák's great skill at turning folk-like idioms into concert masterworks, the Slavonic dances apparently sold out in a single day, which was unheard of, especially for a theretofore unknown composer. Brahms was always committed to helping Dvořák out, and he even dedicated a good chunk of his free time, which was not ample, to proofreading Dvořák's music, much to the Czech composer's utter confusion. Brahms' devotion to Dvořák lasted until the end of his life, when the elder composer told Dvořák that his wealth, vast as it was from sheet music sales, was his if he ever needed it. Dvořák was deeply thankful to his old friend and champion, but declined both that and the idea of moving to Vienna. Dvořák did indeed go to Vienna, but it was to visit the dying Brahms and go to his funeral. He never really stayed there full time. But that came much later. In 1877, tragedy struck as he lost all 3 of his children, one in infancy, another from smallpox, and the last from phosphorus poisoning. To compensate, he threw himself into his work, a setting of the Stabat Mater and a smattering of Slavonically inspired pieces. This ended up being one of his most productive periods, and from thence Dvořák was part of the musical establishment, not just in the German-speaking world, but as far as England, which loved basically any composer of international renown because they hadn't really had one of their own since Henry Purcell died in 1695, and also in Russia, where Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky invited him to conduct some of his own pieces in order to help the burgeoning musical culture that he was trying to create in Russia. The only setbacks he faced at this point were from performers and audiences who were somehow biased against the Czech people, but these were few and far between, and it really didn't slow him down one bit. In 1892, Dvořák set sail for New York City, where he was tasked to run the National Conservatory of Music, which paid him a whopping annual salary that turns out to be around $400,000 in today's money. By contrast, this was about 30 times the equivalent position at the Prague Conservatory. Although details as to the National Conservatory's actual fiscal operations are extremely hard to come by, it seemed to have operated primarily off of private donations and off of state funds, with little to no cost of actual attendance on the part of the pupils. You see, at this point, America really had nothing in the way of an established musical identity. Sure, there were American composers. There was Amy Beach or Edward MacDowell, but they were working in a European idiom. They weren't truly American composers. Even though Dvořák had no earthly idea how you're supposed to run a conservatory, they, I guess, thought that he would be a guy who would know how to actually create some kind of school of American music. If nothing else, he established a legitimacy to the institution that just got started. He found the answer to the question of American musical identity in the form of African American spirituals, and also in the form of Native American music. He thought that these would be the idioms in which American composers would work, that they would take these songs and these rhythms and these forms, and they would adapt them into their own version of the European tradition. Much like he and the other musical nationalists had taken folk music of their homelands, he saw this great wealth of folk material that American composers could use for their own work. Did this happen? Well, not exactly. Music history is not always cut and dried like that. But Dvořák was really committed to using the conservatory as a method of promoting this idea of how American music should be. And he actually directed the conservatory open its doors to any black composer who wished to study there. But the conservatory got off to a rocky start when the Panic of 1893 hit the banks. And this doesn't sound like much to our modern ears, but this is what economists would call a full-blown depression. It didn't get that bad again until the Great Depression, really. Dvořák's pay was slashed in half, and the institution was just having monetary difficulty. Dvořák's contract was up in 1895, and he didn't want to stay in the United States for the rest of his life, but the years he spent in the States were fruitful. The New York Philharmonic commissioned his New World Symphony, which, if not based on outright folk tunes, certainly draws from American folk idioms. This was later numbered as his ninth, due to some post-mortem rejiggling of numbers, but he didn't see it as his ninth, and anyway, we're going to get to the numbering in a second. Dvořák spent the summer of 1893 in Spillville, Iowa, which, for those of you unfamiliar with the geography, is in the far northeast corner of the state. He was there because it was primarily a community of Czech immigrants, which probably eased his homesickness while he was there, but certainly didn't do any good for him after he left. He knew about this place through his violinist secretary, who was actually from Spillville, and while there he wrote his so-called American String Quartet in F major. This is one of his most American-influenced works. I once heard a transcription of this for saxophone quartet, and it was really quite good. I think Dvořák would have approved. Also from this era is his B minor cello concerto, which ranks up there as amongst the best examples in the genre ever written. After his contract was up, he and his family set sail for Europe, and he was glad to once again be back in his homeland. Chamber music, which was always a large portion of his output, became even more of a focus, as he pretty much gave up on the idea of writing symphonies, although he did not see himself as having written 9. The large-scale works were operas, as he was eager to establish himself in a genre that had kind of eluded him in the past. He succeeded, especially in 1900's Rusalka, which has a repertoire staying power that the others lack. The others simply aren't good enough to justify the extraordinary numbers of extras that are involved in any production. Let's just say that his operas are not idiomatic in terms of cast numbers. At this point, Dvořák was hailed as a kind of a national hero, putting Czech music on the map. Dvořák was not the first Czech composer to establish an international reputation. That honor went to Bedřich Smetana. But it was Dvořák who achieved a wider international reputation, primarily because he was able to write pretty easily in any form. He was equally at home in the symphony, the solo piece, and chamber music, or in opera. Dvořák was indebted to Smetana for his use of Czech material in art music, and without Smetana, Dvořák would not be the Dvořák we know. Dvořák began suffering from an undiagnosed illness in late March of 1904, and died on May 1st of that very year, at the age of 62. He complained of kidney pain, and although the doctor's initial diagnosis was that he died of a stroke, it was more likely a pulmonary embolism, brought on by his confinement to bed and the influenza he caught in the last few weeks of his life. Though his output had decreased in the years since he returned from the United States, he still left a great many works unfinished on his desk. His funeral was a countrywide mourning event, and he's the only composer I know of to have had a ship in the United States Navy named after him, although there are probably others. There are a lot of ships. Dvořák's music, as established, is deeply rooted in the folk traditions of his homeland, but he was also deeply enthralled with classicism, specifically the works of Franz Schubert, with their beautiful melodies and unusual harmonic turns of phrase. His chamber music contains on occasion the odd ensemble, such as his Opus 47 Bagatelles, which contain in its instrumentation a harmonium. The opus numbers, by the way, are not to be trusted as an indication of where a piece lies in his collected work. For Dvořák and for many other composers who were just breaking in onto the scene, publishers would often assign just a random high number to a relatively early piece to make it seem like the composer was more well established than they actually were at that point. Now to the matter of Dvořák's 9 symphonies. He only saw himself as having written 5. In fact, there were only 5 actual numbered symphonies published during his lifetime. The first four were lost for whatever reason. They all have their different stories behind them, and while they were eventually recovered, number 5, when it was published and when it was first premiered, was considered to be his first symphony. By the time the New World Symphony rolled around, it was not number 9, it was rather number 5. When Dvořák's work was being edited and collected after his death, scholars soon realized that there were actually 9. The story of his first symphony is the most entertaining of all of these. He actually submitted this to a competition, but because he was running so low on paper, he didn't have another copy, and he never got it back. He thought that the piece was lost, and he changed it when he was actually writing down all of his collected works. He changed it so it wouldn't actually be a symphony. He didn't want to have written a symphony and then have it be lost, so he just changed the title of it. This changed hands a bunch, and it bounced around a bit, and eventually it landed in the shelves of a Leipzig bookstore, where it was bought by a guy who, get this, his last name was also Dvořák, although there is no relation that I know of. It was then treated as an odd family heirloom, until the buyer's son announced that he had the score in 1923. Dvořák's humility and his love of the natural world made him, by all accounts, a very pleasant person to be around. He was also deeply Catholic, to the point that he actually lamented the fact that Brahms, for all of his beautiful music, believed nothing. Brahms was an agnostic through and through, and Dvořák could not believe how someone who wrote such music could not believe in any higher power. He was absolutely fascinated with the then modern kinds of transportation, especially trains, and often he would derail his composition lessons with students just to ask about the train journeys they'd been on and if they had any hot train gossip. When he came to America, the newfangled steamship became another mechanical fascination. Dvořák's music has enjoyed a wide popular reputation, but this is perhaps at the expense of it really being dug into and analyzed by theorists and musicologists, which is especially surprising given the number of cross-movement motifs he uses in his multi-movement works. This is something that usually makes analysts' eyes pop out of their heads. This is a bit like what happened with Tchaikovsky. These were both two composers who were considered not just widely popular, but as directly appealing to a popular idiom, and as such their greatness as composers in their own right has sometimes been diminished by academic types who figure that popularity means that they're not actually substantive pieces of art, which I think is a false dichotomy. Dvořák's reputation also still primarily exists on a relatively small body of work, a small scattering of his best pieces. Fortunately, the Dvořák pieces that people know best are some of his best pieces, exemplifying him at the height of his powers. Dvořák, at his best, presents great and memorable folk-like melodies, combined with a penchant for ever so slightly twisted harmonies and forms evocative of Schubert. "I should be glad," Brahms once said, "if something should occur to me as a main theme that occurs to Dvořák only by the way." And if that's not an indication of greatness, I don't know what is.